Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle
Good
Marie-Pierre.
day, everybody. I am Marie-Pierre Elie, and I'm extremely happy to be with you today. The topic of this conference is so interesting, and this excites me. One health for the whole living beings. So this is organized by the group called seule, santé, one single health, within the framework building the sustainable future at the University of Montreal. So the group One Single Health does collaboration and research, which is multidisciplinary research for the implementation of this one single health approach with several stakeholders. This conference will be mostly in English, but you also have access to the simultaneous translation. Just click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Then you can choose either the English or French language. One health, so that care can be provided by a physician or a veterinarian to a human or to an animal. When you connect the dots between human health and animal health, usually this is about diseases that you find in both animals and humans. Everybody can look at different types of animals. It might be bats in this COVID situation. It might be other types of animals such as pangolins. But in 2019, not many people heard about these animals, about virus transmission. So often in medical science, we are so anthropocentrist, and sometimes we don't leave very much our labs. We don't go outside very much. Now, if we turn out our vision towards animals, not just because of potential virus transmission, but also to shed light on our own biology, whether our own diseases, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurological disorders, mental health issues, or even our sexual life, we could better understand humans and possibly provide better care. Primates have heart disease, which is similar. Koalas have STDs. Reptiles have other types of diseases similar to humans, whether it's cheetahs, rhinoceros, uh, camels, dogs, or even insects. All of them might have cancers. And this was probably also the case of dinosaurs a long time ago. This is what we can learn in the amazing book signed by our guest today. Subiquity is the book. It's been translated in 9 languages, and it was awarded the AAAS Award of Excellence in Science Book. She is a cardiologist, biologist of evolution at Harvard. Let's welcome Dr. Barbara Howards. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I want to, first of all, thank the organizers for putting on this wonderful conference, and I'm just really thrilled to be here. So today, I'm going to make the case that by looking across species and evolutionary time, we can better understand the cause of disease, we can accelerate biomedical innovation, and we can become more humanistic. And by we, I'm talking about physicians, human healthcare professionals, particularly. Now, we can do all of these things if we are able to do one thing specifically. And that is something which I ask all of my students to do when I start my classes with them, and I'm going to ask you to do today. And that is to check your human exceptionalism at the door. Because human exceptionalism is a blindfold, and is a blindfold that prevents us from recognizing connections across species and across evolutionary time, which once visualized allow us to have insights and make connections intellectually, scientifically, humanistically that are otherwise obscured by anthrocentric views. Well, these are big claims. We're going to understand the cause of disease better. We're going to accelerate biomedical innovation. We're going to become more humanistic. And I think I have like 25 minutes. So here is the plan. We're going to take a whistle-stop tour through my journey to just give you some perspective on how it is that I'm doing this today. I'm going to give you an example of how this species spanning and evolutionary approach can allow us to understand the cause of disease in a deeper way. An example of how removing the blindfold of human exceptionalism can actually accelerate innovation. And finally, talk about some of the ideas that I have about how human exceptionalism impairs our ability to be humanistic. All right, journey. Well, very, very quickly, I've spent most of my career as a cardiologist, as a professor of medicine at UCLA, specializing in heart failure and cardiac imaging. And to make a long story very short, my life was transformed by a telephone call from one of the veterinarians at our local zoo. And they were calling me because a chimpanzee at the Los Angeles Zoo had a neurological event, and they wondered if I would do an internal cardiac ultrasound to exclude a problem inside of her heart. And this is a procedure I had done on many, thousands of human patients. And I should mention that veterinarians at zoos take outstanding care of their animal patients. But from time to time, they reach into the human medical community for certain kinds of procedures. And I was one of the fortunate physicians who had the opportunity to work under their supervision at the Los Angeles Zoo. Well, over the period of really years, I was going to the zoo to occasionally, when called, and thrilled to do this, to exclude an aortic dissection on a gorilla, a wide range of pathologies. In this picture, I'm actually doing a post-operative check on a lioness, a geriatric lioness, who had developed a large pericardial effusion, a collection of fluid in the pericardial sac that was impacting her hemodynamic performance. And I worked on a collaborative veterinary physician team to drain that, and she did pretty well for several years. Well, during this period of time, I was having this interesting experience, but I had several moments of light bulbs, real aha moments. And one of them came on that first day when I put the probe down, and this is what I saw. And for those of you who are not cardiologists, what you're seeing over there on the left is an ultrasound of a 4-chambered beating chimpanzee heart. And just to point out, the left ventricle, the right ventricle, these bouncing balls here, these are blood clots. And the atria, the upper chambers of the cardiac, of her heart are enlarged. And the moment I saw this echo, it reminded me of this human patient that I had done the same procedure on several months earlier. And it turned out they had the same form of cardiomyopathy. And the reason this was an aha moment for me was that in all of the years that I had been taking care of patients with this problem, teaching, writing, I felt very, very knowledgeable. I had never once read, listened to, even thought about the spontaneous occurrence of this problem in a non-human animal. Had I thought about it in terms of the role of laboratory animals in biomedical investigation? Yes. But I simply had never stopped to ask myself what non-human animals are vulnerable to this disorder. And that was an interesting moment for me. Well, over the course of these years, I was increasingly wondering how I could take this experience of seeing breast cancer in a lion, or a compulsive disorder in a bear, or kidney failure, et cetera, in these non-human animals, and how could I make the connection to human medicine? How could I use this to make myself a better physician, a better teacher? And I wasn't sure, but I became convinced that human medicine was missing something very, very profound because of hundreds of years and beyond, really, but certainly centuries of human exceptionalism. And really by that, I mean an anthrocentric approach and a kind of lack of awareness, let's say. In any event, I ended up fortunately being introduced to this woman, Catherine Bowers, who is an animal behaviorist and a science writer. And together we have been on this journey now for almost 15 years to really see whether we can, what we can do to broaden people's views, physicians, nurses, human healthcare professionals, and beyond, by bringing together the communities of human veterinary medicine, evolutionary biology, wildlife biology. But it started with our Ubiquity conferences. And we started those in 2011 to bring veterinary schools and medical schools together. And this was the first one. It was UCLA, School of Medicine, UC Davis, School of Vet Med. And this handshake, the dean of the medical school, the dean of the vet school, this was the handshake that we sought to replicate. And our Ubiquity conferences, you can learn more about them down at my website, which is below. But the point was to really bring the fields together. And Catherine and I then, of course, wrote our book, Ubiquity. And when we first conceived of this idea, I was thinking about physical diseases like heart disease and cancer and infertility and orthopedics. And that was it. And it felt like a very tall order to try to really identify ways to see how physicians could better take care of their human animals by learning about how veterinarians care for non-human animals. Well, during this journey, although I had intended this to be only somatic, I was, for the first time, learning about psychopathology in animals. This is a compulsive behavior in this dog breed that's seen, compulsive tail chasing. This is an example of a stereotypia compulsive behavior that's seen in some animals. Some polar bears are one of them under certain conditions. This is an example of feather plucking disorder, a very severe form. And again, this was not on my radar at all. And I have to say that when I finished medical school, I actually trained as a psychiatrist before I did internal medicine. I finished medical school, and a number of people in my family are psychiatrists. So I did a full training. I was chief resident. I practiced for a year. And in all of that training, I had not once ever heard about the spontaneous occurrence of mental illness in a non-human animal. So ultimately, by the way, this was also, we were encountering even the idea that animals ate beyond satiety at that time was news to me. And I share my lack of awareness. It really is ignorance. I'm being nice, but I share this because unfortunately it remains. There still is a great deal of ignorance on the part of many physicians about psychopathology and beyond in non-human animals. And so ultimately the book had half of its chapters focused on anxiety disorders, eating disorders, self-injury, sexual disorders, etc. Well, ultimately I had to figure out how was I going to make a connection to human health? What was I going to do? Yes, these things were interesting, but what was the importance of this scientifically and beyond? Well, I was fortunate because as an undergraduate and graduate student, I had studied evolutionary biology and the work of this man, Nicholas Tinbergen. And as many of you know, Nico Tinbergen was an animal behaviorist who was one of three that won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1973. And among Tinbergen's most important contributions was a recognition that in order to understand why, in order to understand why any biological phenomenon occurred, it wasn't enough to offer a mechanistic explanation, right? As we do this as physicians all the time, right? We say, oh, the patient had a heart attack because there was an aggregation of platelets that lodged in the proximate portion of the right coronary artery. Yes, that's very mechanistic, but Tinbergen would say it's really a description. It's not an explanation. He said it's not enough to offer a mechanistic explanation or a developmental explanation to say, well, the individual developed this problem because they were in puberty. That was still descriptive. In order to answer why, Tinbergen asserted, one needed to offer an evolutionary explanation, an adaptive perspective, which required looking across species, looking phylogenetically. And so after about, it's a long story, but I ended up adapting a Tinbergian model to understanding how we could use human experiences, animal experiences to inform human biology. And this, of course, is I think all of you are familiar with what a phylogeny is, but of course, a phylogeny is a sort of a tree of life, essentially. These are models that evolutionary biologists use to recognize the connection between species and their characteristics. And this is the most famous of all phylogenies. This is what Darwin was scribbling in 1837. And of course, the humility of this is so wonderful. Do you see up here, I think? Well, I began doing systematic reviews and creating taxonomies of disease vulnerability and then turning them into phylogenies. And what I really wanted to do was to challenge myself and my physician colleagues to explore all of the unexamined assumptions that many of us have about the uniqueness of diseases to our species. And atherosclerosis, of course, which is the leading cause of death in humans, was one that I chose very early on. Because atherosclerosis is so clearly linked to cigarette smoking and obesity and high blood pressure, the lifestyle factors associated with modern human life, I had no concept that the essential vulnerability, the vascular vulnerability, the endothelial characteristics that render human beings vulnerable to atherosclerosis might also exist in other vertebrates. And while, of course, other species are not, dying of athero the way we humans are, I was able to find in every major taxa of vertebrates at least one example of an animal with a spontaneous occurrence of atherosclerosis. And then also looking at lifestyle cancers these are breast and lung and colorectal that are so associated with modern life. Of course, we do many things to amplify our risk as humans, but the essential vulnerability exists across chordates. And even, and this is very important, has become increasingly important to my work and my thinking, mental illness, something that I had not thought about at all. And I really did have so many unexamined assumptions about mental illness that this experience of looking comparatively has really transformed how I think about psychopathology. Why build phylogenies? Well, very briefly, because they can help us better understand the cause of disease. Let me give you an example. As a cardiologist, you see fear-triggered fainting all the time, right? This is the kind of thing that happens when someone is giving blood, right? It's you've seen this. This is probably a college student. He's giving blood. He starts to get a little bit woozy. They recognize what's going on. It's called vasovagal syncope. Vasovagal syncope. And it is, I used to teach the physiology course to the second year medical students at UCLA. And when I would teach vasovagal syncope, I would explain that it resulted from a paradoxical bradycardia. Bradycardia is a slowing of the heart. Paradoxical bradycardia. Why did I say that? Well, why should fear cause fainting? I mean, why would the heart slow in response to fear? It does seem paradoxical. One would expect a sympathetic response, that fight flight, the accelerated heart rate under fearful conditions. And yet, in vasovagal syncope, under fearful conditions, the heart rate slows. It seems maladaptive. It seems paradoxical, but only if you have a species-centric, a Homo sapiens-centric point of view. As soon as I began looking across species and building a taxonomy and then a phylogeny of vertebrate species in which there were cases of bradycardia in response to fear, it began to transform how I understood the cause of vasovagal syncope in humans. Let me give you an example. I was able to, so this is actually the phylogeny of acutely slowed heart rate. There are different terms for this: alarm bradycardia, fear bradycardia. The point is, these are species in which this can happen. It doesn't happen all the time, but look at the range. Look at the phylogenetic range from big cats, from phyllids to this was very broadly apparent. And when we see that on a phylogeny, one possibility is that this characteristic, this reflex, this trait has adaptive function. It is conserved because it has biological benefit. It is fitness enhancing. How might slowing of the heart rate be fitness enhancing? Heavens knows it is not fitness enhancing for a human being to faint at the top of a stair and fall down and fracture their skull or their hip. But perhaps our 200,000-year-old species has retained physiology that may no longer be adaptive for us, but was profoundly adaptive for our animal ancestors. And particularly this is the possibility, and it's really a hypothesis, but I believe it is true, that there are plenty of examples that you can find now of studies where this was done decades ago. They put EKG leads on a fawn. They played wolf howls to frighten the fawn. And what you see is the heart rate plummeting from 200, there we go, down to about 50. And boom, you see this loss of motor tone, this immobility. And this tonic immobility is a way to hide for young animals. You see this actually, there's lots and lots of video, increasingly you can find it on YouTube, of this response. Very quickly, I'll show you a clip that illustrates how a tonic immobility, in the case of bradycardia, how being still might in fact, and does, save lives in the wild. In the moments prior to this video, there is a young cheetah that has chased down an impala. But just as she's about to eat, this more mature, large spotted hyena comes and takes the prey. And don't worry, it has a happy ending, so to speak. All right, so the cheetah's coming, hyena chases off. Now watch the impala, don't watch the hyena. Boom. And so you see that tonic immobility, whether it was mediated by the slowed heart rate or not, was adaptive. It allowed this animal to have the possibility of passing its genes on. So this is the kind of perspective. And so all of a sudden, instead of calling vasovagal syncope paradoxical or idiopathic, or we don't know why, we only are ignorant about that if we have the blindfold of human exceptionalism, of that anthropocentric approach. So I hope I've convinced you that at least there's the possibility that by removing that blindfold, we have a chance of understanding the cause of some diseases in a deeper way. There are many other examples, but that's one. I also promise that that by removing the blindfold of human exceptionalism, we could accelerate innovation. And here is one of the ways that I believe this could happen. The field of biomimicry, of course, is blowing up. There's so many fields that are using biomimicry. And what is biomimicry? Well, it really recognizes biodiversity as a source of solutions, right? That evolution is this hyper iterative phenotype optimizing process, and that what results is biodiversity, which is the source of solved problems. Well, one of the challenges for human medicine to use biomimicry is that there's a tremendous lack of awareness. You'll notice that I use lack of awareness instead of ignorance, but it's ignorance, but I'll call it lack of awareness. There's a lot of, medical education does not contain any, it's biodiversity, animal life. It's not a part of the human curriculum, perhaps understandably, but it's not wise. When I lecture at veterinary schools, I always get either it's a hat or it's a t-shirt or a mug that has some version of this kind of joke or this little jab at physicians who deserve it. I would say we deserve it. This is real doctors treat more than one species. So we physicians, we learn to take care of one species. Veterinarians, of course, learn to take care of all the other species. But this is really a problem. And biomimicry there's so much potential, but it's not been leveraged yet in human medicine. Probably the best example of biomimicry, this is the bullet train in 1964 in Tokyo. This was a very important moment. Japan was coming back after the war. It was a big success, except when the bullet train decelerated into the station, it caused a tremendous amount of vibration and reverberation. And so one of the engineers happened to be an amateur birder. He was an ornithologist, and he knew that the kingfisher bird had this beak that had evolved to pierce the water without a ripple. so as not to scare off prey. And he redesigned the bullet train, the nozzle, the nose of the bullet train. There are many other examples. The ability of certain amphibians to regenerate limbs, and so on and so forth. The Nobel Conference in 2019 the theme was bio-inspired medicine. And they actually, I was keynoting, and they actually held a Ubiquity Symposium the day before. And they asked that we theme it on women's health or female health. And so I'm going to spend a moment or two just to share with you how I think biomimicry can be used in medicine. And I'd like to focus on women's health. And actually, really, let's call it female health, so as not to be exceptionalists. Here are three very important issues for the human female health, right? So heart failure is the leading cause of death in women. Reproductive senescence is a very significant problem. And of course, gestational hypertension, which is the leading cause of fetal and maternal morbidity in the West. So the Heart Failure Project is the one that I'm most active on right now. And it's based on the hypothesis that giraffes have species-specific adaptations that allow them to have thick hearts without heart failure. So what's the problem on the human side? Quickly, high blood pressure. We have an epidemic of hypertension, high blood pressure. And what is the problem with high blood pressure? Well, it increases the workload on the left ventricle, which causes it to thicken. And when it thickens, it stiffens. And when it stiffens, it is thick and stiff, and it leads to heart failure symptoms, shortness of breath, exercise intolerance. Well, the giraffe, when the giraffe is born, a neonatal giraffe, its brain is very close to its heart. But as its cervical vertebrae expand and the neck grows longer, the brain is pushed farther and farther away from the heart and vertically away. So that left ventricle needs to pump harder and harder. And in fact, as the giraffe grows, its ventricle becomes thickened, hypertrophic. By the time a giraffe is an adult, its systolic blood pressures can exceed 300 millimeters of mercury. And yes, their ventricles thicken. But remember that giraffes are prey species. Leading cause of death on the savanna is predation. And so there's powerful selective pressure to not have this stiffening of the ventricle and this fibrosis that we see in other mammals who have increased workload. And so we believe that species-specific adaptations, that this evolutionary pressure has led to a unique adaptation that allows the giraffe to tolerate high blood pressures without heart failure symptoms. Gestational hypertension, I think you get the picture, but the point that's so exciting to me about this is that the pregnant giraffe, the female giraffe, the challenges of pregnancy, the hemodynamic challenges of pregnancy in one female animal can inform the pregnancy health of another, and actually vice versa, which is an important part of this story. It goes on and on. There are many, many other parts of this project, which I'm beginning to focus on. This has become really my primary focus, female health across the tree of life. But what we need to do is we need to change medical education if this is going to work. Biodiversity contains solutions, but there is no way for MD PhDs, for physician investigators to access that, to think that way, if there is a narrow anthropocentric Homo sapiens centrism baked into human medical education. It won't happen. Finally, I made the case that by removing the blindfold of human exceptionalism, by thinking in a species-spanning way, by really thinking evolutionarily, we could be more humanistic physicians. And that's a tall order, but I really do believe this is true. And one of the major ways we can do this, and it doesn't cost anything, it doesn't require any technology, is to think about how knowledge of mental illness and obesity and other highly stigmatized disorders in humans how knowledge of their occurrence in other species might reduce stigma. Mental illness, let's focus on for just a moment. Over 50% of Americans with treatable mental illnesses are not getting treatment. And regularly the NIMH points to stigma as a barrier to care. And stigma, it takes many forms, and we know this is a big issue. Well, in my classes of undergraduates, at Harvard, I teach a course which focuses largely on psychopathology, also physical illness across species. But I have the students look at videos of animals with mental illness. This is, compulsion. And they do a self-inventory of what they are feeling, their attitudes toward the animal. And then I show a human being with the same problem. And they do an inventory of their responses. And invariably, their responses to obesity, an obese dog, versus an obese human are different. A hoarding human versus a hoarding animal. This is a feather plucking disorder in the bird and something called trichotillomania in a human. And what they begin to see really is that in themselves, they begin to recognize the stigma, the discrimination. I believe recognizing that these disorders are based on common neurobiology, ancient neurobiology that evolved in our common animal ancestors can help counter some of the toxic, destructive, and scientifically inaccurate theories of causation that lead to stigma, self-loathing, self-blame, and are a very major barrier to care. So I think this is an opportunity. I give talks to veterinarians sometimes, and I have to say that I believe every time that they're taking care of a dog or a cat or a bird, the client is watching them, and the kindness with which veterinarians take care of animals who are suffering in general, but particularly with mental illness, with psychopathology, is important for the clients to watch so that we can learn how we should take care of ourselves and how we physicians should learn how we can approach individuals with mental illness. Well, of course, this is an important challenge. And there's a barrier, and one barrier, and I'm going to move into the end here, but one of the barriers relevant to being more compassionate and reducing stigma and thinking about through the use of comparative psychopathology is the problem of anthropomorphism. And I'm bringing this up as we close because I truly believe comparative psychopathology can transform how we understand ourselves. And it's there's barely any collaboration at this point between the fields of human psychiatry and veterinary behavior. There's some, but not much. Anthropomorphism. So what is anthropomorphism? Well, in 6th grade, when we read Animal Farm in school, I was told that anthropomorphism was the projection of animal characteristics, human characteristics onto an animal. And I was told I shouldn't do it. It's not scientific. Don't do it. Anthropomorphism, projecting human characteristics onto an animal. Well, it's interesting because there's been, we have millennia of ambivalence about the animal mind, right? So although Darwin in 1872, and his book on the expression of emotion in man and animals, Darwin writes animals like man feel pleasure and pain, but overcoming centuries of damage that was really done by philosophers and religion and all kinds of forces that really were not kind of accepting of this kind of the concept of the animal mind, a holistic understanding of animals and their behavior. Overcoming that has proven extremely difficult. And even Freud, who loved his dogs, this is his chows, he's photographed with them, he really saw the animal brain as really a state of it was arrested development. It wasn't a kind of a holistic, and the concept of the animal mind was not part of his theories and beyond. Well, Increasingly, when I think about anthropomorphism, I realize that my 6th grade teacher gave me the wrong definition. The definition of anthropomorphism is not the projection of human characteristics onto an animal. The definition of anthropomorphism is the projection of human characteristics onto an animal in ways that are not scientifically justifiable. It was 1973 when I read Animal Farm, and a lot has happened scientifically since then. And I have to say that when I think about anthropomorphism as I was, admonished about it back then, that admonishment was based on the assumption that we humans are so exceptional, so different, so uniquely unique, that to ascribe human characteristics to an animal's behavior was ridiculous. But look what's happened since then. The field of neuroscience really did not exist as it does now. I mean, it exploded in the 1980s and 90s and beyond. Comparative genomics has now informed us of the degree of our connectedness with other species. And of course, molecular phylogenetics can now help us pinpoint precisely when we diverged from other organisms. And so in light of all of this, it becomes clear to me that if there is a scientific error to be made, it isn't anthropomorphism, but rather the human exceptionalism that underlies the concern about anthropomorphism. And we truly need to examine this, because I believe by looking across species in evolutionary time, we can not only understand causation of disease better, we can not only be more creative and innovative in our approach to therapies and prevention, we can be more humanistic, and we can be better doctors to all of the patients that we take care of, whether human or non-human animals. I'm going to close with one of my favorite quotes. At the Nobel Prize ceremony in 1973, when Nico Tinbergen and the 2 other animal behaviorists won the Nobel Prize in medicine, the presenter started his speech with the following words. He said, "In shameless vanity, we baptized ourselves the wise apes, Homo sapiens, the wise apes." Well, whether in fact we humans are wise enough to move past our human exceptionalism and recognize the benefits of looking across species in evolutionary time is unclear. But what is clear is if we do, we will be able to understand why our patients get sick, be in a better position to identify solutions, and be more humanistic towards ourselves and towards the planet we all share. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horowitz. I'm sure if we were live, in person, the applause would be very loud. Je m'adresse maintenant rapidement au public pour vous faire savoir
And now,
que...
very quickly, please, dear participants, now you can ask questions. Just use your button for questions, and we're going to go to the Q&A question session at the end of this conference. We hope you have numerous questions, and we will have to choose a few of them. Now, let's go back to the English channel.
Manon Desmarchelier is assistant professor at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at Université de Montréal. Bonjour, Dr. Desmarchelier.
Hello, Dr. Desmarchelier. Good day.
Wild animal medicine specialist with a specific interest in animal behavior. I'm curious to know if you see these connections between animal and human health in your everyday work. And of course, I also invite you to ask your question or your questions with an S to Dr. Horowitz.
Thank you, Marie-Pierre. Yeah, absolutely. We do see these connections, and I think first I'd like to thank Barbara for this very inspiring talk. And I would have a million questions, but I'll try to stick with one. I think what strikes me the most when I hear you talk is how much, as a veterinarian, I had absolutely no idea that I could know things that could be useful to doctors. I mean, as a zoo and wildlife veterinarian for years, I've used the knowledge from human medicine. I mean, when we treat our primates, we go to see what you're doing, and we're using it. And I've also learned a lot about evolutionary biology while I was taking care of many wildlife species. And you mentioned like giraffes, parrots, there's so many. But I never thought any of this could be useful to human medicine. Marie-Pierre mentioned pangolins, that I've been advocating for pangolin conservation for years, but I was doing it for pangolins, never to think about preventing a global pandemic. So now, as a specialist in animal behavior medicine, so sort of an animal psychiatrist, most of the patients I see right now are aggressive dogs. And I feel like when I treat aggressive dogs, I feel like I do something useful for public health. So helping humans in a way, because like we prevent bites, for example. But as I dove a little more into the actual evolution and biological functions of aggressive behaviors in various species, I realized that the definition that you use in psychiatry for aggression defines two different types of aggressions that are exactly the same type of aggression that we see naturally occurring in predators like cats or wolves. And because they will hunt and kill very coldly with no emotion, but they can also attack and display aggression under the emotion of fear. Which is what we see in humans. But in dogs, in my patients, we have selected for the absence of, for example, predatory aggression. It's not normal for a dog to display that. It's been hundreds of years of selection to get this out, but it's never out of the genome, of course. It's just not expressed, maybe. So, um, I wonder, because dogs with predatory aggression, we don't have a treatment for them and we don't know how to prevent it. But I realize it's the same way in humans. Humans who coldly killed people, there's no treatment and we don't know how to prevent it other than putting them to jail. So I start wondering when I hear you talk about, like, are there more than we think that we could use in animal so if we could treat these dogs, if we could understand what's going on, why are they expressing this ancient behavior that was highly functional in the past, but now is considered not normal? If we could see why they actually do it or not, could we help prevent some form of human violence? So as veterinarians, we already work with human health professionals. Like at the University here of Montreal, we have some very well-known researcher at for example, the GRESOPS. It's a group based at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, focusing on zoonosis, epidemiology, public health. They study rabies, Lyme disease, neurocystic sarcosis, and way more. We work with public health multidisciplinary teams studying animal a human relationship, whether it's positive to reduce our stress or negative with dog bites, for example, in our northern communities. So there's a lot already done. We also, veterinarians, are leading some research on dogs detecting cancer or infectious diseases. And here in Quebec, I don't know if you knew that, Barbara, but veterinarians are actually allowed to inject people with the COVID vaccine. We are part of the team. So we are already working together, but I think we could do better. So my question for you is, what are your suggestions for us to connect, to better connect human and veterinary researchers and also human and veterinary healthcare practitioner? How do we find the person we need to do more research with, and how do we encourage them to do so?
Well, thank you. That's fascinating. I want to just go back to your example of the dogs and where some of the connections might be. And of course, you know, the challenges we are talking about different species. So the fact that there are all of these overlaps, that that I had been very blind to, doesn't mean that there aren't many, many unique characteristics, of course. But one of the really interesting connections related to aggression and to psychopathology in general, I learned about it was a few years ago, I saw a paper in a veterinary journal that looked at the incidence of psychopathology in dogs who had been raised in commercial breeding facilities or who had been born, basically puppy mills, right? Versus a more positive, or like a pet store versus a more positive environment. And looked at it was linked to, were they going to develop, like during canine adolescence, aggression, separation anxiety. And so I saw that, and then I went back to the human literature, and we have these adverse childhood experience scores, they call them ACEs, and the number of ACEs that a young human being has really does track quite well with their chance of developing mental illness. And so you look at this, you think, my goodness, there's this overlay of developmental vulnerability, right? So this is a connection about windows of sensitivity, potentially, in which and it's not really very surprising. I mean, John Bowlby, right, who was the father of attachment theory, he's a very famous psychoanalyst. He was Konrad Lorenz, whose work on imprinting, Goslings and imprinting. Bowlby went to get help from Lorenz to develop a scientific basis for what became attachment theory. So these things are connected, and evolution is part of it. But that was just my thought about the aggression piece of it. But in terms of bringing people together, my frustration is what it was back then led to the creating of the Ubiquity conferences. It's very hard for me to put I do it as a passion. It's a huge labor, but it has been helpful. There've been about 10 or 11 of them, and a vet school reaches out and says, hey, can you help us put it on? That's really for clinicians, but then we had one or two which were more about investigators. So I think the leadership needs to come, honestly, more from the veterinary side. And we need to find the killer app, let's say, to show the human community, the human health community, how important this is. And of course, COVID, my goodness, the world's attention has focused on the connection between human and animal health, but it goes far beyond zoonoses, right? It's cancer, it's heart disease, and of course, behavior.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. Let's now maybe add a little hint of philosophy to the discussion and dig a little bit further into its evolutionary dimension. Our next speaker, Frédéric Bouchard, is a philosopher of science. He's also the Dean of the Faculté des Arts et des Sciences at Université de Montréal. Professor Bouchard, please enlighten us with your thoughts and questions to Dr. Horowitz.
Merci Marie-Pierre. Thank you, Dr. Horowitz, and thank you, Marion, for your comments. I don't know if I'll add enlightenment, but let me add to what was already given to us very generously today. And let me say that to a philosopher, your talk was a really good example of how complex explanations are. What types of explanations can we provide? And I think you illustrated very well that, if you take an organ, well, you can ask, well, what is it doing? But in medicine and for many other purposes, the real question is, what is it supposed to do? Mm-hmm. And that question, it's, for this ignorant, person in this topic, I was surprised that evolutionary medicine hadn't been seriously entertained before. Just because as soon as you start thinking about what is the, let's say normal or natural purpose of a trait, obviously the evolutionary explanation and the phylogenetic explanations have to be provided. So I don't want to, I think this is a very powerful insight, and I'm glad that you're sharing it with us, and that Tinbergen also before and others in the past have worked on this. But I must say, and this is not a dig at my colleagues in the med school, but I'm surprised that in some sense that it wasn't kind of approached, ever since Darwin in a very straight fashion. And let me try to push a little further some of the ideas that you proposed. And so I think you show really well how it's a mistake to think of human beings as, let's say, historically isolated. That if you look at evolutionary history, it would be very strange that Homo sapiens would be so radically different from other species that then trying to understand its functioning would be possible without looking at prior species. So I think that's a very powerful point. And the examples I'm going to use in my intro to philosophy of biology class, because I think there's a really good continuity between species that you draw starting from humans and then looking back. So human beings are not, let's say, historically, and I mean historically here in terms of evolutionary history, they're not historically isolated. We are animals. This should not be a surprise, and it should not be a surprise that evolutionary history would be pertinent to do medicine. One thing, and you haven't talked too much in this talk about it, the pangolin example, obviously alludes to that, and I think Marion has worked on these issues, and some of her colleagues at the vet school have worked on this, is that we're not ecologically isolated. So even if you don't take into account evolutionary history, even if you look just at T1, the complex interactions between species are extremely pertinent to understand current functioning. And here, I think, the emphasis on, gut microbiome and other interactions with other species such as this, I think is a good indication that ecological interactions, so contemporaneous interactions between organisms from different species, do have extremely significant effects on human health and, well, the health of any organism. So I guess, going one more step and taking this idea that we're not, let's say, evolutionary history isolated and that we're not ecologically isolated. An idea that I'm personally invested in is, I think you correctly point out that we're too anthropocentric. I would argue that we're too organism centric, that we're focused on individual organisms from, single lineages with fixed boundaries and relatively simple ecological interactions, whereas a lot of interactions between species actually give rise to, well, we often refer to as symbiotic communities, or for eusocial insects, would be, superorganisms where you have collectives of multiple organisms working as wholes. And so I would say that my hunch is that the next time you'll be giving this talk in Montreal, that the, let's say, the interactions, the evolutionary interactions between species will be part of the story. If enough people follow your lead and look at this, the next step of evolutionary medicine would be will be doing what you have invited us to, but would also look at human health beyond thinking of human beings as much more than Homo sapiens. So being a human being is a big Homo sapiens, like a big ape, a big primate, with, a lot of microbial communities working, as an organ. And the example I give my students is that in many respects, my gut microbiome is much more essential to my survival than my toes. My toes are 100% Homo sapiens. My gut microbiome is 0% Homo sapiens. And so how we conceive of human beings, if we go further down the evolutionary medicine route, I think it has to take very seriously the possibility that, human beings, but other organisms from other species are actually multi-species communities that have evolved and are evolving. So that's kind of the ideas that, that I've been interested in a while, but hearing your talk has given me, a new angle to kind of think about how this should go forward. And my question will be, if you have ideas about what I've just pointed out, I'd be extremely glad to hear them. One question that I have is maybe the flip question that Marion asked so I think you demonstrate very well that medicine has a lot to learn from evolutionary biology. But let's say that you convinced all of us and that now we're all, interested in evolutionary medicine. What can evolutionary biology learn from medicine or from evolutionary medicine? So, do you have any ideas about how does it refine, adaptive hypotheses making or methods or types of explanation? So let's take for granted that everybody agrees that evolutionary medicine should be taken seriously. What lessons could we bring back to evolutionary biology looking at non-human organisms? But thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk, and I'm glad we have this opportunity to exchange on these ideas.
That's also a very interesting questions, but Dr. Horowitz, would it be possible to try to answer in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, because we would really like to keep some time for the questions of the audience?
Sure. So I'll address really the question of what can evolutionary biologists learn, like where are the bidirectional arrows, how do those work? One point is that usually evolutionary biologists will originally, right, what remained from evolutionary history was the bony fossil record, and so understandably that's sort of the first, what you have is what you're going to work with. And now, of course, we are able to look very, very reductively, and we literally to the level of molecular phylogenetics. And so you see that kind of approach to understanding phylogenetic relationships. Where I think there's a blind spot for evolutionary biologists is, and understandably, is the nature of physiology itself, complex physiology that is extremely dynamic. So it's unusual. I mean, yes, we have bones and things that are relatively static. I mean, they're not, but and then we have the autonomic nervous system, right? Which is the internet of the human body, which is this hyper dynamic, there's tons of variation shaped by experience, but literally provides tremendous phenotypic flexibility with a single individual. I think it's important, and how these complex systems evolved. And by the way, these complex systems, like the autonomic nervous system, inform every aspect of human physiology and human brain function. From affect to cognition to inhibition, etc. So I think that there's this opportunity to have physicians and evolutionary biologists have conversations so that the definition of trait is expanded. And that's one part of it. I have another thought about the perils of being taxa specific, but that's for another day. Too narrow.
Thank you very much once again. Et c'est maintenant votre tour, cher public.
Now it's your turn to answer your questions. I know there are plenty of you. Thank you for attending, and thank you for sending so many questions, actually. So let's start the first question in English.
Several scientists had encouraged the training of human and animal physicians together, especially when it comes to anatomy, physiology, and general pathology. Would you suggest to come back to this type of training and desiload medical training? Should this common training be even expanded also to include topics in environmental health or even social sciences?
It is absolutely a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned that there should be a much broader view. In any enterprise, the broader the overview, the more integrated and holistic the insights are going to be. I think there are barriers. These are not scientific barriers. They are cultural, historical barriers to doing that. But I get probably 100 emails a year from students who are going to medical school, but they also want to go to veterinary school. If they're in veterinary school, there's a real interest in this. And I find it incredible that, at least in the US, you can get an MD, PhD, of course, MD, MBA, MD, JD, there's programs. And yet here there's this profound, important, I mean, irrefutably critical connection between human and animal health. And there isn't a single joint program. I actually have medical students who are veterinarians, right? But it's to acknowledge the value of co-training. I think that would be very powerful. There's a history, at least in the US, about there used to be more training, co-training, and then there were some historical events. Of course, ultimately, and I'm talking to people in Montreal, so you know this better than I do, but you know, the famous Virchow quote, right? So Rudolf Virchow, the father of modern pathology and one of the fathers of medicine, he said, between human and animal health, there is no difference in all of this. But what's interesting is that, of course, Osler, Sir William Osler, when he finished medical school, right? And it was in McGill, I think, he did a year in Europe and to train with the greats. And he trained with Virchow. And of course, you know, Osler is considered one of the fathers, not only of human medicine, but of veterinary medicine. So I think this common parentage is interesting and not well known on the human medical side.
Merci beaucoup. La prochaine
Thank you
question.
very much. And the next question is a very broad question, but I think it's very interesting. Tomorrow is the World Day Against Cancer. So what can we learn from other species about cancer treatment? What do we have to learn?
Can I answer?
Of course,
that,
yes.
Yeah. So I think it's tomorrow's Cancer Day. I was reading it and I was listening to you. Yeah. So is it, what can we learn or what can we, to me, cancer is the area, apart from zoonotic infections, where there's a wonderful example of how innovation can be sparked and by these collaborations. In 2003, the National Cancer Institute, which is under the National Institutes of Health, started the Comparative Oncology Program. And this was really to acknowledge that dogs are vulnerable to many of the same cancers we are, whether it's melanoma, lymphoma, osteosarcoma, right? And they created this program. It's essentially, these are clinical trials for dog patients, right? Who, the way we would have clinical trials. And the cancers that are looked at are cancers that affect both dogs and humans. And the benefit of this COP and projects that have many studies and programs have been launched since then, is that it acknowledges that the natural history of many of these cancers are nearly identical, and that what's learned in one species can be applied to another and vice versa. I always think it's important for physicians, when I talk to groups of medical students or physicians, to remind them that, you know, we have this responsibility. I mean, God knows in the 200,000 years that we've been on this earth, we've exerted a catastrophic impact on millions of other species. So from a moral perspective alone, we should not be so anthropocentric. But as we begin to look at these collaborations and ways, whether it's at the, you know, cancer or any other disease, that we have to constantly be reminding ourselves that what we learn about humans, we're also learning about animals, but we need to be explicit in the translational benefits, that the arrows of the translational benefits go in both directions. That needs to be in the front of our minds, so we don't repeat the problems of the past. The other cancer insight, which is huge, of course, is the famous story from the St. Lawrence estuary of the aluminum smelting facility. I mean, this was one of the first stories that I'd never heard about this. I mean, when I was writing Ubiquity, it stunned me that, and I think there are I know experts right here. I'm looking at Marianne. But these beluga whales were dying of cancers, including adenocarcinomas, breast adenocarcinoma, I think adrenal adenocarcinomas, renal adenocarcinomas. And of course, this was essentially an early warning of an environmental catastrophe that could impact humans as well. And so as all of these factors, is, you know, habitat destruction, deforestation, ecological degradation, all of these things are erasing the lines that formerly separated human environment from animal environments. being aware of the emergence of cancer in other species living in our shared environments has taken on just unprecedented salience for human health.
Merci beaucoup. On a peut-être le temps pour une petite dernière question.
We have time for one last question. We are in this COVID pandemic. We humans, sometimes we are bored due to the pandemic. What about animals? Do they get bored as well? Can animals get bored?
I think you're talking about wild animals, but I have to, could you?
Yes, I do. Do wild animals get bored sometimes? Do we know that?
I'm not an expert on wild animals, but so I don't know. But the one thing that I would just say to this is for many, many years, I kept hearing, oh, X doesn't happen in the wild. X doesn't happen in the wild. And it always struck me like there was something wrong. And I finally realized what bothers me about that. Any statement, when you imagine, there was a paper a few years ago that estimated there are 8.7 million other species on planet Earth. And if you think about what do we humans really know about animals? Well, we know a lot about a few animals, right? We know the species that we encounter and that we study and that someone publishes about, in the peer-reviewed literature. If you actually think about the number of animals and individuals, not even the number of species, but the number of individuals, like E.O. Wilson comes up with these, huge numbers with like endless zeros of individual animals. And you think, how can we, the hubris that we have to say that anything does or doesn't happen in the wild? So this, to me, it's like this moment of extreme humility. We have to adopt that position, but at the same time, for me, it creates this wonder and this excitement about what we don't know. It says, as far as I'm concerned, it's as unknown as space in a sense. So we have a lot to learn.
A lot to explore. On pourrait continuer comme ça pendant des heures, c'est certain.
We could continue like this for hours. And unfortunately, we have reached the end of this conference. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to our guests, Frédéric Boucher, Marion Desmarchelier, and a very, very special thanks to Dr. Barbara Horowitz. Thank you so much for sharing your ubiquity perspective. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge that you have shared. Thank you. Thanks a lot.